And when Peter piped up and asked a question, why are you doing that? They did the same thing to him. And I said, that's outrageous. Somebody should do a story about that. And my dad, who's a really good guy, said, well, I kind of thought that's what your business was. And I was gonna go to the editor and I was gonna tell him, I have this blockbuster story about state-sponsored torture. My first big break happened very early in my career. I had no career. I just graduated from, did I graduate? No, I was still at the University of Minnesota. I was on the 7-year plan in college. Not exactly an academic superstar. 1974, I started going to college. I told people that I was a journalist. Being a journalist was cool. It was post-Watergate. There was still the vapor trail of Woodward and Bernstein. And my problem was I hadn't done any stories, so I kept going to school, waiting tables, doing internships. One day my father came home and said, my friend Peter was on the south side of Minneapolis, which is where I lived at the time. And he saw 2 black men get arrested, and when they're in handcuffs, the police officers continued to wail on them. And when Peter piped up and asked a question, why are you doing that? They're already in custody. They did the same thing to him. And he said, Peter ended up hospitalized. He got beat up really bad. And I said, that's outrageous. Somebody should do a story about that. And my dad, who's a really good guy, said, well, I kind of thought that's what your business was. I didn't even really know where the Minneapolis Police Department was, had no idea of how to operate in a police record environment. My sort of blue sky thing was that I was gonna develop this huge story, and I was gonna go to the editor of the Twin Cities Reader, which was the local weekly, and I was gonna tell him, I have this blockbuster story about state-sponsored violence and torture. And of course, first I had to do it. So I was on my own without credentials, bumbled my way along, and I would go down to records in the Minneapolis Police Department. It was this same guy over and over. I would ask for this record or that record. After a while, the guy just said to me, I tell you what, why don't you just tell me what you're up to here? Well, I think these 2 guys are serial perpetrators. They're what's known as thumpers in the police department, and they have a history of rough arrests. And I said, okay, I got it. And suddenly, as if falling from heaven, all these documents started coming my way. He never did any more than wink at me. He never explicitly said why he was helping me, other than the fact that he probably himself was a good cop. You have to keep in mind that this was Minneapolis during the 1970s, and it was like the whitest place on earth. Everyone looked like me. The food was white, the landscape was white, it was always snowy. It was sort of a white overclass and then a black underclass. It was a police department that didn't really reflect much in the way of diversity. It really had no accountability in terms of what they did. In the instance I was covering, you had 2 black males, and in this instance, you had a big group of people gathered around as they were arrested, and they were being quite verbal about the fact that the cops had them under control, cuffed behind them. You can't do a lot of damage once you're cuffed. I guess because maybe they had resisted on the way down, the cops wanted to issue a little street justice, a little payback. It just sort of defied common sense. I wrote up this huge story. I can remember when I was working, I showed it to my friend David Brower, who was a journalist in Minneapolis. He said, well, let's begin with some basics. A lot, that's 2 words, just so you know. It's my first story. So I typed up probably a 10,000 word story, and I went to the editor, the editorial office of the Twin Cities Reader, which is in downtown Minneapolis. They let me in, and the guy who's sitting there, Brian Lambert, who's still someone I know, sat there, and I said, you know, your newspaper has been totally soft, hasn't had any real news in it, and I've got a story that I just think is gonna crack the police department wide open. And I kept talking and talking. He just sat there and went like this, give me the story, give it to me. And I was hanging on to it because I just wanted to explain why the story was so important, how I had gotten it. He read it and called me and said, I think it's good, it needs some work, but yeah, we're gonna go with it. It'll probably be on our cover in a week or 2. And I just about peed my pants. You might as well have told me I was going to be in Rolling Stone. I had grown up on that newspaper, which unfortunately no longer exist. And the idea that my story and my name would be on the cover of this weekly that hosted many writers that I admired, I just was beside myself. Long story short, published the story, ended up having some personal encounters with the officers themselves. They were not good guys, but eventually over time, they were weeded out from the Minneapolis Police Department. I began a career first as an investigative reporter, and nowadays I write a column, which means I never go down to the records department in a police station almost anywhere. And it taught me a really important lesson, which is these people who are, gatekeepers or secretaries or clerks or stuck in some record room. They're very important people to a journalist. If you think a story is true, you should be able to make it true. And if you have a feeling that things went down a certain way, they probably went down a certain way.